Hello students and welcome to tonight's homework help. Tonight we'll be looking at political cartoons and propaganda during World War II. Your assignment was to analyze the piece of United States propaganda that you were assigned. If you're looking at the title slide here, as you obviously are, you might recognize the image because this is the image that we looked at in class. So, hopefully you recognize it. It is Dr. Seuss. A few of you may have received a different piece of propaganda produced by Dr. Seuss. But what I loved today was how many people were shocked that Dr. Seuss acted as a propagandist during the war. And as you'll see as we move forward in this unit, he's certainly not the only one to do so. Right? Others like Disney and big names in Hollywood offered their efforts to help promote the U.S. war effort against Nazi Germany and Japan. So what I want you to do first is to take out your AP Parts analysis sheet. The AP Part sheet, if you're not familiar already, but you should be from freshman year, is the U.S. History Department's guide to analyzing images, and for the purpose of today, we're using it for propaganda and cartoons. So Wachusett's History Department created this tool, and we're going to use it. I'm going to show you how to use it today. So if you pull out that sheet, you see it's two-sided. The first side is the giant chart, AP Parts. You can see I cut it to fit both sides to your handout onto this one slide. If you were to flip it to the back, you would see the political cartoon and propaganda analysis guide that I created to go along with the AP Parts guide that the department created. So how does this work? Well, you can see it's an acronym, stands for author, place, prior knowledge, audience, reason, the main idea, and then synthesize. And what you're tasked with doing is using this chart to get at basic information about the image you have to analyze tonight. So, with each of you given a different cartoon, you're to take this chart and apply this chart to that cartoon or piece of propaganda. Tomorrow, when we come in, you'll be paired up with or grouped up with people who had the same cartoon as you and put into what we call expert groups. These expert groups will then discuss where their analyses overlap, and then we'll present to the class to get at common themes throughout all pieces of U.S. propaganda, and then we'll look at different forms of media other than just imagery. So that's the plan moving forward, and what I want to do first is get at the basic information using the AP Parts tool. I will then show you by the end of this video how to apply the analysis guide that I created to just bolster evidence to your claims in the actual chart on the front. So that will make sense later, but let's first look at a piece of propaganda. Okay, so you might clearly see, maybe I should have warned you it's a little bit offensive, but I'm not going to model how to apply this tool with a piece of US propaganda because I don't want to give away too much about what some of the common themes strewn throughout US propaganda may be. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to model how to use the AP Parts chart on a piece of Nazi propaganda. So let's do it, right? Start with A, author. Who created the source? Well, obviously the Nazis, right? But if I want to be a little bit more specific, I'm going to look very closely at this entire image, and I'll see no specific artist's name, but at the very bottom I'll see Less Storm SS. You could throw that into Google Translate, but the SS symbol is pretty clear, and based on our prior knowledge, you can bet that this is produced by either a tabloid or a magazine put out by the SS, which is a division of the German military. Place, this is going to be a little bit more difficult, where and when it was created. You might assume, based on prior knowledge, this is obviously propaganda to convince people that Americans aren't what they say they are. So this is going to be produced and released in Europe somewhere. So I'm already sort of flowing into the audience part of the AP Parts chart, and that's fine. If I were digging a little bit deeper, I could look at the bottom and see, well, that looks like German, but is it? I could throw that little sign in red at the bottom into Google Translate and find out that it's actually Dutch, right? And that this was actually produced in the Netherlands. But, if you're digging that deep, you're way ahead, so that's great. But if not, okay, there's a strategy to consider. For reason, why was this source produced? Well, again, reason and main idea, as we will see, kind of share a lot in common. We know that during war, it's important to generate enthusiasm for your side. And if you can't do that, for whatever reason, I don't know, maybe you're Nazis trying to take over all of Europe, and you're trying to convince one of those European countries that your side is better than the side that claims to be liberating you, you might want to convince the people otherwise. So, throwing mud, right? Mudslinging. This is what we're seeing here. So it seems like the reason this was produced was to bash American culture and make their claims illegitimate. So the main idea and the reason, what we'll find is the AP Parts tool is very good at analyzing images of all sorts, but when we run into images like propaganda and political cartoons that have a very, I guess what I would call, what would I call it? Argument-heavy message, reason and main idea tend to be very similar, if not the same. So we'll often just collapse those two boxes in the chart into one giant box. And then to synthesize, I want you to really hold off on doing that box until tomorrow when you're in your expert group. So we'll get to synthesize a bit later. Now, okay, I've just made some pretty big claims using the AP Parts tool. I've made some pretty generic basic claims, but how did I arrive at them? That's where we want to apply, believe it or not, a math strategy to looking at images. So what we're going to do, as you can see, is to draw a line. So actually take out a pencil and draw a line on your cartoon, whatever it was given to you. Do that now and make quadrants. So some of you do, first of all, don't turn the video off. I know this sounds like math, but this is still history, and this is very effective. I even did use the math counterclockwise quadrant method to make it more familiar to you folks who have to do this every day in the math wing. But anyways, what we're going to do is split up the image into 4 different quadrants so that we can examine each quadrant very closely. We can then reference the quadrants when we're talking in our expert groups about imagery, symbolism, all the things that are on this political cartoon propaganda analysis guide. So to keep this video short and succinct, what I'll do is just run through a few of these things quickly. You can see that the labels are all over the place. The biggest one is at the top in quadrants 1 and 2. It says liberators in red. And then you're looking at this monster coming over from the US. Well, how did I tell it's from the US? Well, look at quadrant 3. In the background, you can see this monster sort of crawled across the ocean, and you can see the Statue of Liberty in the background. So it's sort of like, well, this monster must have crossed over the Atlantic from the US. This monster thus represents America. Okay, if I'm looking at symbolism, and I already made the claim that this is supposed to be an image that debases the United States, well, where do I see that in symbols? I don't even know where to start because there are so many. If we start in quadrant 1, which seems like the likely place to start, we can use our prior knowledge to suggest that in quadrant 1 we see a man hugging a bag of money. Hiding behind that bag is a banker of sorts. If you looked at other pieces of Nazi propaganda, which we already have in class, you might assume that they're making this out to seem like America is funded by or run by Jewish bankers, part of the Jewish conspiracy that Nazis were pushing. What else can we see in quadrant 1? Well, we see the head of the monster is wearing a Klan robe, a Klan hood, referencing our troubled past in the years after the Civil War that you learned about last year, that we call the Reconstruction years. And actually, it goes well beyond Reconstruction. There are multiple iterations of the Klan, which we'll talk about. Quadrant 2, again, almost too many to name. You've got Miss America, cultural appropriations everywhere here. We've got, Miss America is wearing an Indian headdress and playing a trumpet on top of an arm that's holding up a record with a lynching rope hanging off of it. You'll notice that both of the arms on this monster are black, referencing African Americans, but specifically in quadrant 2, Miss America is resting upon a black arm that's holding up a record. We've already talked about how the jazz movement was fueled by African American music steeped in the history of slavery, but that white bands, what we call blue-eyed jazz, benefited the most in the record industry perhaps even more so, white male driven, benefited tremendously from the cultural roots of African Americans. The Native American headdress sort of speaks for itself. Native Americans by the 1940s were moved onto small reservations and not really given in the same rights as white Americans were. So the jazz music industry, which was founded on the backs of African Americans, sort of juxtaposed to the lynch rope, which is another throwback symbol to Reconstruction violence, and then it just keeps going on and on. I don't want to make this a half-an-hour video, but you've got the two arms, one being an executive, corporate person, the other arm being, a reference to organized crime like Dillinger or Al Capone, and it goes on from there. So ultimately, what you can do is when you're filling in your AP part sheet, the quadrants are very useful for citing your specific detailed content to make your claims. So if my overall claim is that this piece of propaganda is calling the United States hypocritical, I'd have so much to point to, but when I get together with my expert group, I want to say, well, it's calling the United States hypocritical because look at quadrant 4. All right, they claim to be liberators, but they're indiscriminately using bombs on these European cities that are killing civilians. So they have blood on their hands too. They're not liberators. All right, so, okay, I think we've got the gist of how to use this. So tonight, what you're going to do is apply this to whichever cartoon or piece of propaganda you were assigned. For those that had this one, I think you can already see, just based on how we ran through the Nazi piece of propaganda, how the AP Parts tool will help get you started, but more specifically how the analysis guide will help make sense of the different sections of this cartoon. And I don't want to say too much about it because this is one that's actually assigned. Tomorrow, after we get into our expert groups and you guys discuss these things, we're going to look at different forms of media and try to apply the AP Parts tool to things other than images. For example, you can see here if I play this. Now, I'm going to turn the audio off. I don't know if you heard that, but again, you would see that movie theaters were pretty successful forms of entertainment during this time period, and when you went to a theater, you often saw shorts. And Disney and the WB, Looney Tunes produced numerous, almost too many to count, pieces of propaganda for the war effort. You can see this one here, shows Minnie Mouse at home asking Pluto if he wants some bacon grease, and as she's about to do that, she gets a message from the US government about why that might not be a good idea. And again, instead of going into why it's not a good idea or analyzing it for you or letting you even hear the audio here, consider this a teaser for tomorrow, okay? Why is Pluto so mad? That doesn't seem right. The US government should not deprive him of his bacon grease. So what's the mastery objective? Tomorrow's goal is going to be to look at a bunch of different pieces of US propaganda and try to answer this. How did the United States use propaganda to help achieve its war aims? So ultimately, not at the end of class, but the next day we're going to get together after hearing all the presentations of the different types of propaganda that were used and answer this in essay form. There'll be more on that in handouts and discussion. I think that's all that I have for you tonight. Just know that this video will survive and live on my repository website of things that you might want to revisit later. This is not the last time we'll be using AP Parts, and though we're going to move beyond World War II, you might find this useful again. In fact, I will reference this, and so I don't have to continue making these sorts of analysis guides in the future. This is the one that's going to be hosted on my website for you to use. So if you have any questions, again, feel free to email me or ask me before or after school. You know when I'm available. All that information's posted. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had fun. Now get to work and have fun.